We're good to go? Cool. All right.
How long are we going, Thomas?
We usually shoot for around an hour, but
Okay.
Just
Okay.
depends. If you run out of things you want to say, then that's fine. Or if you want to say more, I
Say
mean,
more,
yeah.
Okay, man.
Yeah. We sort of play that by, play it by ear, see how it goes.
Okay.
Does that
Cool.
work?
Yeah. Hey, I'm just following your lead, my friend.
Cool. All right. Welcome. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Help Me Understand with Dr. Thomas Jeffrey. Today, my guest is Dr. Scott Wigginton, and Dr. Wigginton is a professor of pastoral ministries and counseling at Campbellsville University. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist with over 35 years of clinical experience and is the executive director of Winter Pass Counseling. He has had a heart for experiencing and teaching about God through travel adventures. Some of those adventures include bicycling across America and throughout Western Europe, climbing Mount Rainier and Mount St. Helens, playing basketball with athletes in action in South America, and lots of international travels on 6 continents, including his favorite, Australia. It makes sense then that he would write a book, all of which deals with the role of adventure in spiritual formation. And the book is titled Adventures to Godliness, Filling the Hole in the Bucket List. I've asked Dr. Wigginton to join me today to talk about another interest of his, which is the Enneagrams. So thank you for joining me. And before we get into talking about Enneagrams, tell us about that book. It's interesting because I think people don't think about spirituality formation in terms of adventure. But if you think about spiritual journey, adventure seems to be part of that. Tell us about your book.
It really does. Well, first, hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate being here, and I appreciate the great intro. Half of that stuff are true.
Yeah.
No, Thomas, I had a sabbatical 3 years ago and had wanted to do it in Sydney, Australia, and I've always been fascinated with Australia. Knew pretty much exactly what I wanted to do in terms of teaching, and then some personal adventures, but I really had been thinking and praying about writing something in the area of spiritual formation. And it's occurred to me again and again over time how most human beings seem to be naturally wired for adventure. We define those differently. For some people, it tends to be more adrenaline-based, and I think a lot of people think, oh, it's the guy that climbs Mount Everest or somebody who does an ultramarathon. But I look at adventure as anything that brings an element of freshness. Anything that calls for natural curiosity and moves you into a space, a liminal space, where you can't predict always what will happen.
So art could be an adventure?
Art can be an adventure. Somebody who's 68 years old and they've never done anything with knitting, and they think, I'd like to try knitting, but I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if it, and yet it represents something new and something fresh, and there's an unknown outcome, and there's a chance to learn. And I think moving into spaces, liminal spaces they're sort of threshold experiences. We're not here, but we're not there. Give us the opportunity to learn things about ourselves and about God, and to be formed in ways that we would not really have anticipated.
Is that a way of getting out of our comfort zone?
Absolutely. Or as one of our friends from church said, I remember John Heineman years ago giving a testimony at church and him saying about a mission trip, God didn't call me to get out of my comfort zone. He called me to expand my comfort zone. And so I think that was an interesting way that John described it. But I think there are adventures that we can plan, and I love planning adventures. Yeah. But then I think there are adventures that come to us that we would not court, that we would say, in fact, I really wish this didn't come my way.
Yeah. It doesn't feel like an adventure so much as a trial and tribulation.
Exactly, and which is one of the titles of the chapter. One chapter title, I think, is, what I put, Adversity, the Secret Agent of Adventure. And this idea that I wouldn't have wished for this. I would not have wanted to get cancer. I would not have wanted to experience that hard thing. But God can use that, if I'm open to it, to forming me into shaping me in ways that I would not have anticipated. But I've got to be open to learning through it and being formed through it.
Huh. So sort of finding ways to push that threshold, either sometime, as you just described, and not by choice, but by, life, if you will. But then sometimes saying, well, I've never done, I've always wanted to, so why not? I mean, the bucket list is part of the title, right? So
yes, and that was the whole bucket list idea. Is while it's a fascinating idea, and it's actually a pretty good little movie, it's a terrible way to live your life, because at the end of, if you pursue the bucket list, you realize that one of two things happens. Either I become focused on sort of this narcissistic pursuit of the more for my own benefit, or for the sake of a great story, at a dinner party. But then I also realize that there's an emptiness to it. So that it's really like Solomon wrote, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. Here he tried everything, this ancient king who had all the money and resources and everything he wanted, but after trying a lot of it, he said, boy, it's meaningless. And so the idea that while we're wired for adventure, the adventure is supposed to lead us to become something more, to allow Christ to shape us. And so I think that's what's been fascinating for me, is to imagine that, whether it's something that I plan and I take students to Israel, or maybe we go to Antarctica and do something there. It's about more than just having this story to tell. It's about, what do you want to do in me as this is unfolding? And then as I reflect on it, and how can I become more like Christ at the end of the day, because I've been blessed to have this experience, or in some cases, I've been forced into an experience where maybe one of the only ways to move healthily through the experience is to learn to laugh about it. And just to say, well, humor is a great gift in the midst of adversity. And but Lord, what do you want to teach me? And
being open to the experience of God, really just. Well, I look forward to reading the book, and maybe that'll be get you back on, and we can talk about that. And we could talk about that if you want, because it's absolutely sounds very interesting. But I did ask you to talk about Enneagrams.
Sure.
And just for the sake of starting a baseline and helping me understand, what is Enneagram? What?
Okay, so the Enneagram, and for the sake of our viewers, the Enneagram is spelled E-N-N-E-A, which means 9, and then gram, which is just a graph or a diagram. So it's a 9-pointed diagram. I'll tell my students sometimes, please, when you leave, don't say Wigginton taught you the pentagram. No, it's the Enneagram, 9-pointed star. The Enneagram, Thomas, is an ancient instrument. Nobody knows exactly where it originated, but most would agree somewhere around 4,000 years ago, in that same Mesopotamian river valley out of which arose the three great world religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. The Enneagram rose out of an oral tradition where people were talking, just like you and I are today, what does it mean to be human? Why am I so much like Eric, but yet not as much like Tracy? Why am I less like Elizabeth and more like Joe? And so in an oral tradition, mentors and disciples, teachers and their students would walk around talking about, how do we understand humans? And so out of that, a couple thousand years went by, and Christ comes to the earth, and it's predates Jesus by 2,000 years. So as a person who teaches in the School of Theology, I think that's important to note. This is not a Christian instrument. But neither are any other psychological instruments. It's a useful tool, but it's a remarkable tool in some ways because of the ability it has to talk about how humans are very much more predictable in some ways than we would otherwise imagine. We have some great tools out there. The Myers-Briggs personality typology I've always loved. But I've come to believe that the Enneagram, because of its ability to look at spiritual issues, there are 9 types. on the Enneagram, and each type can be given a name, but once you really know the instrument, you just know the person by a number. So I might say of my wife, well, she's a type 2. Of my son, well, he's a type 8. And so that communicates a whole raft of information based on just that number.
Yeah.
So going back to the origins, though, so it grows up in this oral tradition, thousands of years go by. At one point, a group of Jesuits, most people would agree, came to the East. Jesuits are a Roman Catholic group steeped in spiritual direction and spiritual traditions. And they found the Enneagram and they said, wow, this is really amazing. This can really help us to help young men and women understand themselves, understand some of the core spiritual issues they deal with. And I think they were saying this, in some ways, better than anything we've found as a secular instrument, can be integrated into helping persons become all that they were meant to be. So they brought it into the West. And like anything that comes into the West, they began to systematize it, write it down, and a whole body of literature arises. In the early 1990s, the Enneagram became really hot in corporate America. The CIA started using it to profile world leaders. The U.S. Postal Service started using it to mediate conflict. I think it was in 1994. Stanford University held the first international conference on the Enneagram, and had several thousand, I think, attend that. And so,
it had a rebirth at the latter part of the past century, in the 80s, 90s.
Yeah.
It started becoming, it hadn't gone away, but then all of a sudden it found some traction with government agencies and businesses looking at it like, how can this help us?
Yes.
Help ourselves.
That's a perfect way, I think, to describe it. It was, how can this help us to be more effective, to go from good to great, to build our business, to become more successful. And so I think there was a lot of buzz. And I learned it from a friend of mine named Lee Conver. And Lee was the chairman of the Pastoral Care and Counseling Department at Southern Seminary, a great counselor, really wise man. And Lee and I learned it from him, and I guess we've been teaching it now since the early 90s. And it's interesting, in the last few years, it's undergone another rebirth, but amongst a population of teenagers and college students.
Really?
Who
Good.
are now downloading Enneagram apps to their phones or their computers, and they're talking Enneagram language. And so it's been fascinating to see that interest among this group to help them self-reflect and to help them look and how do I understand the persons that I relate to.
Well, I think that's one of the things that struck me as you were describing it, is helping these monks, these Jesuit monks, looking at it going, here's a way that we can help people understand, and you said young people, help them understand themselves, which is the key first, right? We need to understand ourselves, and as we can then relate to others, and then understanding a little bit about them.
Yes.
is sort of what struck me, and then business gets involved, and that's more of a social structural thing. It sounds like I don't know, but that's what it sounded like. But then all of a sudden, people in this age with technology at hand hear about it and start wanting to use it, because goodness knows, helping us understand ourselves in this, in any age, but
right.
with, right now in particular, where there doesn't seem to be a strong sense of, the society, some of the structures of society aren't as important anymore. When I say important, from church, government, education, there's, it seems like now young folks are looking for something to help them just make sense. Like, why do I always react this way? Or anyway.
Well, and I think that's really right. Somebody described the past few generations, and they use I apologize for the patriarchal language, but said these are generations of men with no chest or shallow chests. And the idea being that there's not much self-reflection going on. You know, you may have somebody that's hail fellow, well met, very outgoing, very friendly, but when you get behind the veil, they don't know themselves very well, and there's not much depth there. And I think more and more there may be some increasing interest among this generation of being deeper, of understanding myself better. I certainly think as a therapist, the value of a person knowing oneself, being able to self-reflect, being able to move into relationships with some perspective on what are the hardest parts of me for other people to relate to. Maybe it's my quick anger, or maybe it's a part of me that's fickle in terms of my interests and unable to stay focused. Maybe it's lust, maybe it's envy, whatever the issues are. But I think there's less hesitancy, I think, now for people to say, you know what, I'm in therapy. I'm seeing so-and-so, and they're proud of it. Yeah. As opposed to, I think there have been generations past who've said, if I'm going to get into counseling, which I don't know if I want to do that, I don't want anybody to know. Yeah. And now you've got this generation who's saying, we really think depth in knowing ourselves.
And even celebrities reach, sort of putting out there, hey, it's okay to have these questions. It's okay to go talk to. In fact, you encouraging people to go talk, especially you mentioned not being too masculine or patriarchal, but sports figures. Try to encouraging people. You need to, if you're having thoughts or whatever, you go talk to somebody. It's okay.
Yeah.
So you were in seminary, and Dr. Conver sort of introduced it to you. What got your interest? What made you think, yeah, this is something I want to spend some time with this and understand it better?
Yeah, I was at the end of my doctoral work, finishing my PhD, and Dr. Conver came in as a new faculty member to the faculty at Southern Seminary. This was back in the late, early 90s. And I just developed a tremendous respect for him. He just died some weeks ago, and there's a memorial service, but he became one of the wisest persons I had ever met. And so at one point, I was able to hire him at our counseling center in Louisville. And to be perfectly honest, I hired him so I could learn from him. I thought, I can learn from this guy. And so we spent...
That's good management
technique, well, it was fantastic. And so he served with me on the Life Care Counseling Center staff for 12, 15 years. And then became one of my closest friends. I ended up teaching for him at Southern Seminary. And so we spent a lot of time together, and the more I would listen to Lee, and the more we would process things through the lens of the Enneagram, which was just one lens, obviously, we used, but it was a very, very helpful lens. What I realized is after a year, 2, 3, 5 years, 7 years with a lot of other instruments, I would become sort of bored. Yeah, been there, learned that, did that. I learned how to use strength finders or Myers-Briggs or, take your pick of the disc, whatever. And I would acknowledge the value, but I would get bored with it. What I found with the Enneagram was I kept staying interested because I hadn't reached the bottom of it. And to this day, I think I've got 20, 25 books on my shelf, Enneagram books, and I'm still interested. And so in the past couple months, I've taught it in several different environments, and never do I teach it that when I'm prepping again that I don't think, oh yeah, that's interesting. That has relevance for me. Our family, when our family was young, we would go on camping trips every 2 to 3 years, usually out west. And we would tent camp, and usually I would teach a different instrument each time, or something that we could have conversation around. And one particular trip, I remember we were in the Rockies at Rocky Mountain National Park, sitting around the campfire, and we had done the Enneagram that year. And through that whole trip, that's all the conversation kept coming back to, was how we see Auburn or Hope or Caleb or Elizabeth or myself. And I had been teaching it, for quite some time at this point, but as was my custom, the first time I teach it to a group, before we start going around reflecting on how people might see themselves, I'll say, well, let me put myself on the test block. How do you all see me? And the family had permission granted to talk about old Dad. And so they started reflecting on it.
You got 15 minutes.
and they all came out to the same type, which was not the type that I had been claiming to be for the last year.
Really?
Few years. I'd said I'm either this or this, and I went with this, and they said, we think you're that. And here's why.
Wow.
And our kids by that time were middle teenage years and late teenage years.
So they knew enough of Dad to have some real info.
They were able to tag some things that I probably didn't want to see, but they could name them. And I had to leave the trip acknowledging I've got some things to think about.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happens with the Enneagram, is that for some people, they can find their type quite easily. For other people, they'll struggle a little bit more, and for some, it may take them a few years. But what happens in the struggling and the wrestling is they'll discover things about themselves that they haven't acknowledged before. And there are aha moments when they might, say to one of their friends, sitting around the RV on the camping trip, well, here's the way I see you. And it just makes for some fascinating conversations. And sometimes those happen at lunch over a napkin.
Yeah.
Which is fun.
And that was one of the things that I wanted to ask you about. Like, why is understanding your type so important? Like, how? And what I hear you saying, I'd like you maybe to even go a little further, is it's not just about you understanding you, because you might get it wrong a little bit. It's also about others understanding and you being able to feed off of that, but also understanding other people too. But help me understand then how it works, maybe in an interpersonal level. Your example there was good. What about something a little closer, like two people that are falling in love, perhaps, or any example you'd like to go over?
Great. Yeah. Well, I was Plato or Socrates that said the unexamined life is not worth living, which I think is a great line that speaks to knowing yourself. And for the believer, knowing ourselves becomes even more important from the perspective of, I can't give to God what I don't know. So some of the contemplatives talked about the correlation between self-knowledge and spiritual growth, that for me to be able to grow spiritually, I can only surrender what I understand. And so the Enneagram helps me as a tool to gain some degree of increased understanding. But then the other side of the equation is many of us quote the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which sounds really good, except it's a terrible rule for relationships, because what I want somebody to do to me may not be what they want done to them. Right. So I think the platinum rule is a much better rule, do unto others as they would have you do unto them. And so it suggests then that I'm going to love differently according to the person that I'm trying to love. So while the sense of whether I'm going to love or not may not change, we can all agree, well, I should be a more loving person. Do I have the skill to love people in ways that they need to be loved by, such that I understand them? I think that's the
a
question.
Tough one. Understanding, but maybe that's one of the things. As you said that, I realized that understanding how someone might be loved, whether or not that's a way that I am, to be able to do that. If I understand it, I can be conscientious about that.
Yes.
I can try to build myself for that person. If you love someone, you're going to try to make that relationship stronger. And is that part of it? Is that?
I think so. I think there's with the Enneagram, there are 9 types, and 3 types tend to lead with action. They tend to be action types. 3 types tend to lead with emotion. They're heart types. Then 3 types tend to lead with cognition. They're head types. So if I understand this is a head type, she's very cognitive. She is not as much touchy-feely. That for me to love my wife, who she comes from a cognitive perspective, it's probably less important that I'm greeting her and giving her lots of hugs and have as much maybe physical affection demonstrated. There's certainly some value to that even with that person, but it's probably more important that I talk to her and communicate really clearly about some of the reasons I'm grateful, specifically that I'm grateful for her, and address that cognitive piece. If I've got somebody who's an emotional...
Or even talking through problems, not to interrupt, but a cognitive person would want to...
Yes, talk through. And then if I'm married to somebody who is they're an emotive person, and they're one who tends to over-emote, and they may struggle with emotional regulation, that they're bouncing up and down, and at times might even be accused of being a bit of a drama king or queen, then part of the way that I can love them might be to help them understand how the way they think affects the way they feel, so that it can help them to regulate those emotions so that they're no longer experiencing as much of a bounce. Yeah. But it's still to appreciate within them as well the rich matrix of emotions that they can bring, and even for me to say, well, maybe I'm not, maybe I lead with cognition, but I'm going to appreciate this in you rather than judging it. And I think that's one of the things I find really helpful, is that some of us can tend to be more judgmental than others. And I realize when I really get to know people and understand what some of their core motivations are, I'm less likely to be as judgmental. Yeah. And I think with spouses, in marriage or in couples, we're drawn to certain aspects of the other initially. That one person wrote, I did not meet my spouse before I married them. I simply met their representative.
Nice.
And then I got to know them, and I said, whoa, I didn't meet this person. Yeah. And so the Enneagram can help me understand, why is my wife of 36 years, why is she the way that she is? And it can explain her giftedness, and it can explain her core struggles and temptations. And so if we're all made in the image of God, then none of us can carry the image of God completely. So at her best, Elizabeth carries a part of the image of God that's beautiful and strong. But she can only carry part of that. So you have to put the whole church together to get a more complete picture of, well, I can see part of the image of God in Thomas. I can see part in Elizabeth. I can see part in Susan. But the full image of God can't be contained certainly by anybody, but it's held better by the church, because we see different people made in God's image bringing to bear their best, and that helps us see through a glass darkly.
After half a century of being around religion, I've never heard the church express that way. Yeah, I mean, the metaphor of the body, right? The arms, the legs, the brain, and other metaphors. But you're not using a necessarily a metaphor. What you're saying is we're all pieces of God. Yeah. And in a church sort of setting, it's putting those pieces together to create a more it takes us all being unified, sort of. If I understand what you were saying, it's like you're a piece of God, I'm a piece of God, and a piece is a representation. But by putting all that together, you just get a more and richer and fuller expression of the possibility of what God is.
Yes, kind of. If we used, what are the little things you look through and you see all the facets?
Kaleidoscope.
Kaleidoscope. I think I would almost say that if I look through a kaleidoscope, I see lots of different
Pigmentations
and I think within one human being who's made in the image of God, I can see at his very best, through a glass darkly, something of God. And then I look at this person over here and I see at her very best, through a glass darkly, I can see something of the image of God. And so you put the church together and you begin to realize what beauty and strength
the mosaic
brings that speaks ultimately to a creator who made us male and female, who endowed us with gifts and with beauty. And so it really does help me to understand that. And then conversely, because every one of us is affected by our own sinfulness as well as what we might call sin universal, there's a whole dark mosaic of sin that when I look at this person, if I really see him as he is, I can also acknowledge there's some brokenness. And his brokenness may not be the same as hers. And it may be different from mine, which makes me really tempted to judge theirs and kind of ignore mine.
Yeah.
But the Enneagram points out that every individual struggles with one core sin. And that was one of the fascinating things to me about it. So there are 9 types, so there are 9 core sins. So if I can see if I can go around the diagram, there's...
Yeah, test time.
Yeah. Number 1 would be anger. Number 2 would be pride. Number 3 would be deceit. Number 4 would be envy. Number 5 would be selfishness. Number 6 would be anxiety. Number 7 would be gluttony. Number 8 would be lust, more for power, not necessarily a sexual form of lust, but for power. And then number 9 would be laziness, or classically sloth. And so the theory suggests that every one of us deals idiosyncratically more with one of those that plagues us throughout our life than others. And what's fascinating is that some 2,000 to 3,000 years after the Enneagram started to gain, some influence, there was a group called the Church Fathers that in the patristic period of the church codified sin. And they came up with what they called the 7 deadly sins.
Yeah.
And but the 7 deadly sins they identified had already been identified almost 2,000 years before.
2 they decided weren't sins, really. I mean, when you come out 2.
Well, they added 2. Yeah, they added 2. So type 3 is deceit, and type 6 is anxiety. And so you add those 2, and you'd really be hard-pressed to find more to add to the corpus of sin than those 9 kind of core.
Yeah.
Sin. So I think it's just fascinating, and I say all the time, we do your Enneagram, and you work through, and you're like, oh, Scott, I came out and I'm this, but I'd really like not to be this. I really like to be that. And I hear this a lot. Well, there are 9 types, there is no perfect 10.
Yeah.
So all of us have something that we struggle with. And the good news is that as we grow, there's the ability, if according to the theory, to integrate certain spiritual virtues, redeeming virtues into our life. And when we inculcate those, what happens is they become they help us to overcome the core sins. So they sort of serve as spiritual antidotes.
Yeah.
So, for the type 1, the antidote for anger, and it's a particular type of anger, is serenity. So, here's a person as a type 1 that they're a redeemer, reformer, and they go into situations and they have an unusual ability to pick out in the system what's wrong, what's flawed, and then to figure out a way to help, make it better. Well, the dark side of that is they can be a perfectionist, and so there's a way that everything should be, and it's got to be this way, and if it's not, they're frustrated and they become irritated, and that irritation, it just cascades. So because of their need to live with these shoulds and oughts, they just find themselves angry a lot, ticked off. So one of the stories I tell is of a client I had, it was close to 30 years ago. he and his wife had come in and they were dealing with a lot of fighting in their marriage, and we were doing some work on conflict. And I split a session and said, let's you and I talk today. And he and I were meeting that day, and I said, tell me about your job, what you do. And I'm trying to get a read on what he was like outside of his marriage. And he said, well, I'm a middle manager at essentially a factory. And I said, how do you find that for yourself? What's that like? He said, it's really frustrating. I said, give me an example. He said, well, okay, I'll give you an example. Every day when I come in, we have to go into the locker room. And he said, I go into the locker room, get my hard hat, my, I guess, gloves and my jacket or whatever. He said, when I get ready to go out onto the factory floor, a lot of those guys that I supervise won't close their lockers. I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, they just leave them open. He said, man, it's frustrating. I said, what do you do? He said, I just go around slamming lockers. Boom, boom, I'm slamming all these lockers. And he's smiling as he's saying it, but it's very frustrating to him. Right. So I thought, well, okay, I'm starting to understand your marriage, because that's kind of the way you approach your marriage, is sort of a irritation with every time she doesn't do something according to your standard. So the next week, I was out, and our kids were small, or Auburn was small. I was in a toy store. And I found a sheriff's badge. You know those little tin sheriff's badges they sell? Uh-huh. I bought it and put it in the bag, and next time he came in, we did a little more couple work, and then I split the session again. I said, hey, I got you a present. I threw the bag on his lap, and he said, counselors get presents for their counselees? I said, not usually, but I made an exception. And so he pulls the badge out, and he says, a sheriff's badge. I said, yeah, that's right. He said, what's this? And I said, well, God told me that he wants to deputize you. And it's your job to walk the earth being angry about everything that is not as it should be. And he's like, man, can I resign? He said, that's what I already do all the time. Right. Can I resign? And I said, I guess that's really what we need to figure out. And so, you know, the ensuing conversations were about, for him to overcome this core struggle with anger, he would have to embrace the virtue of serenity, which means it really is okay for the world to be as it is. And the serenity prayer became really important, incidentally, to him, and a lot of times for people who are type 1s. God grant me the serenity to accept those things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Right. But it's just the ability to release and say, it's okay for things not to be as I think they should be.
So what strikes me about the slamming of the lockers is that was all internal. He wasn't punishing them. He wasn't making, didn't change any behavior, you know, it didn't change anything. It just built up within himself, yes, I guess, a resentment that they wouldn't do the right thing, even though it was really him. He's the one that was most upset about it.
It was.
So from a clinical standpoint, you've been able to use this tool, I mean, in this way that you're just describing, but have you found it to be, from a practice standpoint, really useful as a tool in just about any situation? I mean, you're marriage and family, so you've talked about marriage a lot, but then family entails some things. Yeah, I've got kids too. You know, and
oh yeah. In fact, you know, we can talk as a family. We can talk language. We know everybody's type. We know my family of origins types. We know Elizabeth's family of origins types. We talk about our friends, what types they are. And it's just a regular part of our conversation, and it's so helpful. And you know, in countless business environments, tons of churches, men's and women's prisons, executive boards, as I've taught this, what happens is there is a buzz that happens at the first break. And we never get through a session, whether it's end of the day, halfway through the second day, finishing up, that people aren't buzzing about the applications they see with their colleagues, with their spouse, with clients. And so as counselors, you know, we've used the Enneagram for years in training with young counselors. We've used it in case conference groups where we present cases anonymously, and and within the guild help each other to look at how can we best help. And it's a tool that just has so many possible applications. And I think once you learn, well, this is my type, you also learn that on the Enneagram, there's a major type, and then there's what's called a wing. So if we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 around, is a 1, my wing's either going to be a 9 or a 2. And it's sort of like a minor suit in cards. That wing is going to flavor the major type. So a 1 with a 9 wing is going to look different than a 1 with a 2 wing.
Okay.
And so you'll meet somebody and you'll say, well, he's a 1, but he doesn't seem like her, and she's a 1 as well. Well, maybe it's because they have a different wing. Yeah. Or maybe it's because we talk about as a 1, is he an unhealthy 1, a healthy 1, or an average 1?
So now you're getting into the nuances of, so it seemed pretty simple. There's 9, you can memorize those, but now all of a sudden you're starting to build in some layers and some nuances.
Absolutely. And then the other nuance that I think is very interesting is, and I wish we had, and maybe you can insert it into this point in the interview, a diagram. There are arrows. So if somebody, and I'm using 1 as an example, if somebody's a 1, there's an arrow from the 1 to the 7. And it's an arrow that goes toward the 1. So if you're growing and you're a healthy 1, you're growing to take on the positive qualities of the 7.
Okay.
If there's an arrow from the 1 to the 4 that goes toward the 4, if you're regressing under stress, you're seeing the worst part of the 1, and then they're taking on the negative qualities of the type 4.
Okay.
So with each type, you've got a path of growth and a path of regression. You've got a wing. And so there are lots of different reasons why, if I'm telling you about Thomas, I met the most interesting person the other day. I think you'd enjoy meeting him. He is a 5 with a 4 wing. He's pretty unhealthy at this point, so he's really regressing towards blank. I've just given you so much information. Yeah. If you understand the Enneagram, and you can, it might have taken me 20 minutes to communicate all that I've given you in a sentence. So I have the opportunity to work on myself. If I know my type and I know my struggles, there are all kinds of practical applications of things I can do to work on myself. And there's some really practical applications in terms of helping me become a better coworker, a better dad, a more effective communicator. So it really is a kind of a gift that can keep on giving.
Absolutely. So going back to the clinical part of it, how are the younger people? Like, do you find like teenagers, you and your kids, when you were on family vacations, you would go through, but how have you found trying to explain this? Is there I know there's a cognitive level. At some point, it's just hard to get your mind all around it, but how is it when you're, from a clinical standpoint, actually working with families, with kids, not just, the husband and wife or the partners, but also the kids involved? Is it?
Well, I think there's the caution to me that makes a lot of sense is I want to be careful. The younger the kids are, the more I want to be careful about how I work with it. So, because the temptation, if we think, well, if we believe Erik Erikson and his psychosocial theories, the teenage years are identity, who am I? And while we know that continues on into adulthood, it's pretty significant that teenagers are figuring out, doing a lot of hard work, who am I? And so they try on identities like they try on T-shirts. No, that one doesn't fit. Let me try this one on. If I work the Enneagram with teenagers too early and I don't hold it with open hands, I run the risk of helping them attach to something that they may say, well, Scott sees me this way, this must be me, and then they feel like they need to live that out. Yeah. So the earlier the teenagers, I typically don't use Enneagram with kids much below 14 or 15. Okay. unless I'm just really clear with them that, hey, we want to be real careful here. Here's some things you may want to think about. But the truth is,
by the time they hit your college class, they've got a little maturity underneath them to sort of know.
Yeah, when they get to those late high school years, and particularly then when they move into the college young adult years, there's a sense in which we would say they're more closely fully hatched, you know. Right. And so I think for them, I know with my leadership class, every time I teach leadership, you know, that's one of the most rich conversations we have is thinking through the Enneagram. And I was down in Sarasota a few weeks ago with one former student who's on church staff and another one who was doing his internship, and I was teaching the Enneagram to their interns and to some of their ministry staff at that church. And those guys, and you know, they love talking that. And you know, one has taken it 2 years ago, the other one just took it, and they're just because I think they're so much into relationships. And so if they think this can help me in relationships, it can help me know myself, why wouldn't I want to learn it? Right. Years ago, I'll tell you this story. I think it speaks to motivation, particularly with what you picked up on earlier with regard to business. You know, how can it help our business and help our bottom line? I was at a conference of the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy, and I think it was in Vancouver. It could have been Toronto. I know it was Canada. And at the conference, we had probably 2,500 clinicians, mostly marriage and family therapists, but psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, clinical social workers, maybe a few more, maybe psychiatric nurses, a handful of different disciplines, but mostly marriage and family therapists. We had a keynote speaker that year named Elie Wiesel. And, you know, most of us think of Elie Wiesel. He was the Nobel Peace Prize winner, author of Night, survivor of the Holocaust, this Jewish man. And they had asked him to speak that year, and he was not a counselor, was not in the guild. And so, like happens many times after somebody's introduced, the audience was still talking and chatting, and Wiesel got up there in a pretty thick accent, started to speak to us. And the crowd was a little bit disrespectful, but as he went on, there was a paragraph that completely quieted our crowd. And here's essentially what he said. Whether you are a marriage and family therapist, a pastoral counselor, a psychiatrist, whatever is your clinical stripe, every one of you needs to be doing the same thing. You need to be teaching your clients how to become lovers. But you cannot teach them something you've not learned yourself. So before they can become a lover, you must become a lover. And the place went dead quiet.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was kind of an audacious thing for somebody outside of the club to come in and tell us all what we should be doing. But I remember sitting there thinking, in this dead quiet, that sounds eerily reminiscent of a Nazarene carpenter's words when he said, if you want to sum it all up, love God and love people.
Yeah.
And what Wiesel was saying is, whatever you do clinically, it needs to be in the service of loving people and teaching them to love other people, which of course is hard. Yeah. You know, it's hard for all of us. And I think the Enneagram can be taken in that light. I mean, it can be used as a tool to manipulate. So that's what a business might want to do, help with the bottom line, figure out our employees so we can get them to be more effective. Yeah. Or can we use this tool to become more effective in loving people, more insightful about the places our brokenness will block that loving, and more understanding and grace-filled towards people who are very different from us and whose brokenness doesn't necessarily exactly reflect ours.
And that love, the thing that strikes me as your in your story, and then the loving God and loving others, I've always in there believed that it's about loving yourself too. You know, that whether that's a big part of it. To be, and I think this Enneagram thing, the Enneagram is there's there's an insight that you get towards yourself. There's some, and you're not just going around maybe going from a therapist to therapist, and you get all these, and not that doesn't help, but all of a sudden there's this idea of this is kind of how you're wired, or this is, you know, what's going on with you, and to be able to love that. As you know, as you were mentioning earlier in a group about, okay, you've got the good and the bad in this person, the good and the bad in this person, which we're that too. But we don't talk about loving ourselves, and a lot of times when we do, it's in sort of a, you know, you don't put, not be that selfish person or narcissistic person, but being able to have that insight and go, oh, that's why I always retreat. And, you know, I just want solitude. I don't want to be around people. I'm not, you know, and that understanding that's how a person may react to things. And the pandemic being a big one, like, you know, social distancing for some people was, thank you. I could do that with no problem.
Yeah, it was a gift. Yeah. This is the best time of my life. Right.
I'm being asked not to participate in society.
Yeah, I think ego, you know, narcissism, ego inflation, pride. Dallas Willard wrote, I think it was Willard that wrote, that his belief wasn't that we overvalue ourselves, but that pride is valued. Pride is the result of shame and of a sense of not properly appreciating who we are as persons made in God's image and as Christians redeemed through Christ. That it's undervaluing ourselves that results in sort of ego inflation and forms of pride. And I think that's an interesting way to think of it, because normally think just the opposite. Well, he thinks he's better than everybody. But that's really rooted in the fact that at the end of the day, he's not comfortable with the fact that he really does have value, but so does everybody else.
Yeah. Or not the value he covets.
Yes.
Yeah. One of the things that's really, as you've been explaining all of this, the concept is it's psychological in nature. There's a cognitive piece of it too, but there's an imbuing of spirituality that I don't know, and I don't have a lot of familiarity with some of the other tests other than what I got in Myers-Briggs being one of them. But I never saw, that was cognitive and psychological I get, but the spiritual aspect. Now, is that something you as a believer, a Christian, bring to the table, or is that sort of imbued within the Enneagram itself?
Well, I think within the Enneagram, again, I want to be clear, it's not a Christian instrument,
right,
but none of these other instruments are either. So it's a useful tool. What I find different about it is that it's explicit in terms of dealing with profound spiritual issues. So when we look at the antidote, for example, of, let's just say lust, the type 8, the core sin is lust. We normally understand that as a lust for sex, and it can be, but it's more of a lust for power. It's the person who wants to control turf. They want to be in charge, and so there's a core sin which is explicitly spiritual, but there's also redeeming virtue, which if the person would inculcate this redeeming virtue, then they live in victory over that core sin. So the redeeming virtue for lust is simplicity, which is a head shaker. People look at that and they, what? Now I understand how humility could be redeeming virtue for pride, even though we need to talk about what that's going to look like. Right. But why simplicity for lust? Yeah. And the answer is that type 8s, these are individuals who are sort of CEOs, leaders, champions. They never have to have a fire lit under them. They always come with passion to everything. They're natural leaders, and so their natural passion brings them to different venues with decided opinions, persons who are used to being sort of in charge. But if they need to be in charge everywhere they go, it becomes just irritating to everybody. We've all been around the person who's in a business meeting at wherever, and they've got to dominate the meeting, even though they really don't even have expertise in this area. Yeah. But where simplicity comes in is it suggests that this is the person who is willing and able to channel their energy, that God-given passion, to only the simple places that matter most. So in the case of Martin Luther King Jr., who was a great potential example of a type 8, Dr. King, nobody ever had to light a fire under Dr. King. He just probably, everywhere he went, there was passion. Mm. But because he was able to channel his passion into two simple places, his people and his God. In every major city, almost in the United States, there's a road named after him because he was able to channel that and simply say, this is what matters. I'm not going to waste the energy in the other places, but it's going to be for the sake of these causes. So I think with the Enneagram, there's just a spiritual issue around every turn. And while Christians would want to go back and link up to, okay, we need to understand core sins, redeeming virtues in light of the wisdom and insight we get through the Scripture, it's pretty significant that you do have an instrument that can help you speak to how sin works itself out.
Yeah. Well, and that's why, even though it's not necessarily implicit, it's an agnostic tool. Mm. I mean, it's just a tool. It's an implement.
Certainly.
But some of these things that you're talking about, the sin and virtue. Now we can phrase that in. I see those as spiritual concepts or spiritual ideals, if you will. So that to me makes it sort of special, because you're actually saying it's not just about identifying how you are and what might tip you off, or get you going or not, but here's ways to offset that. Like here's what's going on, and here's, as you called it, the redeeming virtue. Here's the thing that you can bring into your life, and to me that's spiritual.
Yes.
I mean, I don't. And maybe I'm overextending that, but I'm one who's always looking for the spiritual. So, but that's what I feel is there's something ingrained in this, however many 3,500-year-old tool that is imbued with the idea of sin and redemption. Yeah. Spirituality, if you will, in a broader sense. Yeah. Not to corner you into saying, "Oh, yeah, it's it."
Well, I mean,
that's not
what
I'm trying to do.
Well, I would say that there's a general revelation. We get through general revelation. God reveals through science, medicine, lots of quote secular, if we want to create a divide, which I think is probably artificial, but God can reveal through the sciences, behavioral sciences, some important concepts. And I think, to me, the Enneagram's an example of something that's a great tool that's come about through general revelation, that we've discovered some things about ourselves that are useful. They're not salvific. We can't, from a Christian point of view, we can't get above the glass ceiling that says if you don't have Christ in your life, you're still you're rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. You can grow. You can be, in the eyes of society, certainly a lot healthier. Yeah. But you said something a minute ago, Thomas, I thought was significant, but as I'm growing older,
but not that significant.
Sometimes I forget. I know what it was. If I'm teaching this instrument to two different groups, let's say I'm teaching it in this one case to a group of church leaders, and I'm teaching it in the other case to a business, a secular business that says, Scott, we just want you to come in, do some team building with our group, teach us the Enneagram. How can it help us to have better relationships? I'm going to teach it in some ways the very same, But where I'm gonna move to a different place is when instead of talking with them about core sins, which is language that they may not appreciate or understand, it may be even distancing language.
Right.
I might talk about core struggles.
Gotcha.
Every type has a core struggle. And so when we come to type 6, as an example, type 6 is the loyalist or the team player. The core sin is anxiety. 6s tend to be really loyal, faithful to responsibilities, great team members because they want to play on behalf of the team. It's really important for them to be a part of something because their core struggles with anxiety, ultimately their anxiety is, I'm out here by myself, nobody's got my back, it's a scary world.
Yeah.
And so if I'm talking to them about the redeeming virtue for a type 6, I'm going to talk about courage. But the way I'm going to teach courage, unfortunately, has to be very different than how I'm teaching it here. What I'm saying to them is, you can have courage because you have what it takes. Whatever comes up, you have what it takes. The problem is, from a Christian standpoint, I don't believe that.
Yeah.
In fact, I have to.
Well,
I
you
teach
do,
it
but there's
differently.
more.
There's
right?
more.
There's more.
You know, you can have courage not because you have what it takes, but because regardless of what happens, you never walk alone.
Yeah.
You know, Christ says I will be with you always, even until the end of the world. He says, I'll never leave you or forsake you in Hebrews 13. So I'm teaching the spiritual side of it in a way that is way more imbued with truth than the best I can do teaching it to a secular crowd is to say, you have what it takes. But I know that you really don't, and I don't either. I mean, can you handle more than you think you could? Yeah. But if you're on top of Mount Everest and a storm blows in and everybody's fending for themselves trying to get below, you know, whatever you're trying to get down to Camp 4, you don't have what it takes. Yeah. And you may be by yourself because your teammates have gotten blown off the mountain or they're fending for themselves. So I think the thing is imbued with some strong, strong spiritual truth, but depending on where you're coming from in terms of your vantage point, you may not be able to access some of that truth because of the kind of belief system you bring in, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, if you're only leaving it at the cognitive psychological level, there's truth there, but I think the spiritual component brings a whole nother level of truth that's really important. Yeah. And I try this on for size in terms of you were mentioning earlier that the younger generations are sort of heading towards the Enneagram, and I think that maybe they understand that there's a spiritual layer to this that as this generation seems to be falling into that Nietzscheism idea that God is dead and so only nihilism and totalitarianism are left. So, but looking for answers and really maybe not even understanding their true spiritual nature, but when they connect with this, it might be connecting that spiritual nature in a way that gets them interested in understanding myself, understanding who I am, and that I'm okay. That explains some things, and here's some remedies, in a way that may not be overtly spiritual, but maybe speaking to something that they feel like maybe haven't been allowed to really tap into. Yeah. Now, I'm just throwing that out there.
But it circles us back to where we started. You were asking some about my interest in adventure and spiritual formation, because I do think that what many are realizing, particularly in the day when you can post everything on the internet, is that everybody's having a great adventure, right? You know, these people just went to Fiji. These guys are in Mexico City. This one just went to base camp at Mount Everest.
According to the pictures.
Yeah, according to the pictures. And what we realize is, I'd like to do those things, but ultimately those things are empty. there's really not, at the end of the day, you can do those and do those and do those, and you're still going to die.
And if you got to keep doing them to feel like life is, anyway,
It's
not insatiable.
insatiable. It's insatiable.
Absolutely.
And so I think where you were leading us a minute ago was there is an inner adventure that is way more important than the outer adventure, because it's possible to go on the best African safari and take nothing away but pictures.
Yeah.
But if that safari can lead you on the inner adventure to begin to raise questions about why am I born in America? Why do I have these unbelievable privileges when, while I loved seeing the animals in Zimbabwe, the level of suffering in Zimbabwe, particularly under a dictator like Mugabe, why in the world was I born here and not there? And what inherent value do I have over somebody living there? And I go on that inner adventure because I was prompted by an outer adventure, and then I can begin to reflect and think about who I am and think about who God is. And it forms me to realize, really, I can't explain why I get to live in this land of bounty.
But that privilege, to the idea that to whom much is given, much is required, that privilege for you to become a better person, that then that ripple effect,
yes,
for you to work on on yourself and to become a better person. Well, you may not directly affect those people, have that, or you could if that was part of your adventure, but that's the responsibility to leave things better.
Yeah.
To at least in my opinion. I mean that. So if there's this idea of, well, I feel guilty about that. Well, guilt isn't taking down the whole system and letting it burn. How about let's focus on making ourselves, paying back through our own personal growth to build a better world in smaller and in ways that make everyone around me benefit others, right? That's sort of one of the things that when I that particular example is what I think this helps us, because the Enneagram and what you've been speaking to, mainly because I believe that the inner journeys are much deeper and higher than what we could do. Now, I love the ideas of adventures as God journeys or spiritual journeys, but that adventure to go inside, that takes a lot of courage too. It takes a lot of okay, I'm an author I read, actually a Native American shaman said, if be careful the questions you ask, because ask the questions that you're willing to accept the answers to. So, so help me understand who I am so that I can become a better person, which in that better person spreads. It benefits others. And that's sort of how I'm reading a lot of what you're saying, how I'm hearing it and processing it.
No, I think that's right on. That if I have the privilege to do some of these outer adventures that are planned, purposeful, that rather than just leaving with the pictures, that I take the inner adventure to say, okay, what do you want to do with this? How is this going to affect me? How am I going to be different as having gone on this safari? And how am I going to become more like Jesus, a better lover of others, of God, even of myself in appropriate ways, as opposed to just taking it in and saying, wow, good, that's another one on my bucket list.
Yeah. Can a person change Enneagrams? Or, I mean, how does that, I really want to be this is my, I'm okay this, but I want to be that.
Yeah, according to the theory, Thomas, no. Once you develop a core self and establish this is my type, the theory suggests that will be your type for the rest of your life. But where the dynamic is interesting is that if I'm a healthy type, if I'm a healthy type 1, then I'm going to grow and I'm going to take on the positive qualities
some of those
7,
nuances,
and I can continue to grow through the diagram to integrate those other positive qualities. But at the core, I'm always going to be this type.
Can a business organizations, do social organizations and groups have an Enneagram type?
I don't think you would say that they would have an Enneagram type in the same sense that individual would, because they're not created in the image of God. But yet what's interesting is I think
the individuals are.
I think they do take on qualities. For example, as a native Louisvillian, when I talk about type 4 is the artist, the tragic romantic. Type 4s are intuitive, empathic, creative. They are strong feelers, probably of all the types, most likely to struggle some with depression. Well, there are two roads in Louisville that represent type 4s really well, Frankfurt Avenue and Bardstown Road. And you can say that's a great example of type 4 energy there. Certain companies, because of the founder, certain churches because of the pastor, there's sort of this trickle down. Well, this is a very cognitive congregation. People self-select in and self-select out based on who's leading. And so if the leader is a type 5 who's a observer, thinker, very cognitive in their approach, you don't see much of the feelings. The congregation or the company can come to mirror that just because that's what the leader puts forth, and people who don't ascribe to that, they just self-select out. Yeah. And of course universities, even you could imagine a university same way over a period of time.
So a social group might change based upon the who's involved and maybe even leadership. Individually, though, so is that a nature or nurture sort of thing, like
with a group?
No,
with an individual.
Yeah.
I think that's a great question. I think it's both. I think there's a sense in which we're created in a certain way, but that the environment we grow up in may reward or discourage that, and so we may find ourselves unnaturally bent in another direction. I know with Myers-Briggs, the interesting thing about that theory is, you find your Myers-Briggs, type out of 16 types. Well, let's say I'm this. About every 2 years up through midlife, the idea is that my type will change. And then about midlife, it settles in and you're going to be the same. And the suggestion is that a lot of times what happens is we're changing the way we behave based on what we think we should be in terms of role adaptation. So if I'm in this position and my predecessor was this or my mentor was this, I may tend to act more like that because I think that's what the role requires. And then time may free me up to say, well, that's really not who I am. Yeah. I'm not as extroverted as that person. I tend to be a little bit more introverted, and I get comfortable with that. And or by midlife, I just give up and say, it's too much work.
Even though we may outwardly, and you sort of mentioned this earlier, outwardly we may portray a type, but when we don't have to put on the act and go home
yes.
to the friends and family, there's a different persona. Mm-hmm. Well, that persona, that outward persona versus the true self, if you will.
Yes, yeah, so true. I know early in my ministry, I was following as a youth minister, the guy who had mentored me was very, very extroverted. And one of his lines was, Christian leaders always up or getting up. And I acted that out for some years in student ministry, and then I realized how tired I was. Mm. And I thought, I really don't want to be this extroverted. And I'm naturally fairly extroverted, but not that extroverted. Yeah. And then I began to realize I can function in what I do, being who I probably more authentically who I am than trying to be him.
Yeah. How do you see? I can understand how business, a family or unit or community even, is there a way to more broadly look at this from a societal standpoint? I don't know. That may be too the kaleidoscope maybe to, make it actually your head explode or something because there's so much going on. But is there a way to, let's contextualize this where understanding ourselves better no matter what, I think is good, and having ways to work towards it. But can society, is there some role that it plays in society as a whole?
That's a great question. What comes to my mind really are two maybe applications societally. I think in America, it's interesting to watch how the presidency casts a certain the type of the president casts a certain valence upon the rest of America and even the world for a season. So President Reagan was probably a 3. Achiever, performer, successful person, sunny disposition, very outgoing, very much about achievement. And 3s are called the achievers, performers. And it was interesting because Reagan, before he became president, was president of the Screen Actors Guild. He was an actor, and you could make the argument, nobody played president better. Now, some would hate Ronald Reagan, but even persons detractors would say that guy could play president.
Yeah.
When he sat in front of the teleprompter and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, bring down that wall." There are people today who would say it came down single-handedly because of Reagan's address. Of course, we know there's a lot more complexity than that. You contrast that with President Obama, who was very much more a cognitive kind of person. Whether he was a 5, there's certainly a lot of 5 in him. I think about Ben Carson, who really seemed like a 5. But Obama's presidency was very different in terms of just the way his personality came across and affected vast parts of society. Donald Trump, an 8, arguably an 8. Yeah. Very different in terms of how that affected society. So we could talk about, is this person a healthy 3, a healthy 5, a healthy 8, or unhealthy or average? And I think that would be a piece of it. The other side of your question that might be interesting to think about would be the importance of valuing difference and diversity. That if I'm president, I don't want to just recruit people who are like me. I want to value diversity in terms of personality type as well as all kinds of, whether it's racial or gender diversity or age group diversity, whatever we might speak of. But definitely the Enneagram is going to emphasize that every type brings something to the table that really is important. And if I just staff a church or a business or a nation according to people who are like me, believe the same thing, act the same way I do, it's probably not going to be an accurate balance.
Yeah. You'll be really strong in one direction, which may end up being a negative. Where as an individual, it's strong and affords for change. When you get everybody like that, everybody on your team,
yes,
you're only moving in one direction because it's all about charge, as opposed to sometimes you need to, set back. No, those 5s are really important to have on your
yes, absolutely. They are. They're really important.
So, is there anything? I have a final question, but is there anything else that you want to add to?
Oh, I think you've covered the landscape really, really well. I would just say to anybody watching, I would encourage you, if you have some interest in this topic, one of the best websites out there is called Enneagram Institute. And I think it's .com. It could be .org, but it's Enneagram Institute. And it's actually a really trustworthy website that you can go and study and find all kinds of good stuff on the Enneagram. One of the things on there is a test called the RHETI, R-H-E-T-I. You can take the RHETI. You'll have to pay to take it. It's the only thing on the website you'll have to pay for. You can do that, or it's been my experience, there's some free tests that if you'll type in free Enneagram test, go take 2 or 3, 4 Enneagram tests and see what rises to the top, and know that just because it's the highest doesn't mean it's your type, but you want a dialogue between the types that rise to the top, the stronger scores, to see what, how do I see myself? And let your reflection on type come out of that dialogue and conversation rather than blindly trusting any test.
Or asking some trusted others, like.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, as you mentioned early on, how we see ourselves, for better, for worse, right? I mean, we can, but how we see ourselves may not be as accurate a representation as how close, trusted others see us, and so. But I think the other thing too is as a way to start, even as a beginning of a spiritual journey, for someone who may just be out there going, you know what, I don't know about this spirituality thing. And I'm not pushing that about the Enneagram, but everything starts with that the inner journey. The going within and recognizing where we are right now and who we are. And then, because only then can I start to reflect upon, there may be an ideal of who I want to be, but that ideal may not be my true self. It may not be my who God has made, as it were. Anyway, not sure that came out the way I was in my mind. It sounded really good, but that's my encouragement. Is even as a Christian or non, a spiritual journey, take a step. And I think Enneagrams are really good and sort of on the surface easy. I mean, as you mentioned, it gets layered, but to take that step to the inner journey. My final question has to do with technology and artificial intelligence.
Whoa.
Yeah. And as I was framing this, I was wondering, okay, so, because I ask everybody the AI question at the end of the conversation. I'm like, well, how does this work? Like, what am I going to ask, And then as I started thinking about it, how it really is about personality and diversity at an individual non-identity level, if you will, like who you are. Like there's 5s that are every race, color, creed, right? I mean, and 8s and all of that. So as we move towards, and if you saw some of the news about some of the Google engineers say they're creeping into being able to, and by creeping, that's a double entendre, into sentient beings. And so that, as I was thinking about this question to ask you, is that something, I mean, are personality types something that we would want programmed in? Can we replicate that? Would that be a sense of sentience because they, each one would have some? That's where I came out. Is like, okay, as we're really at an era of not being quite ready for, humanoid robotic cyborgs, if however you want to be really. I mean, if these people are really serious about making human-like, playing God, if you will, it seems like something like personality types and this would have to be part of the individuality of each. I don't know. Yeah. I found that's where I came out of not in the next 5 years, but maybe in the next 50 or
right. Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question, Thomas. I always say that I think technology is moving faster than our ability to keep up with how to manage it and how to understand it in light of a biblical theology. And so, I think God is the creator and He creates life, and I think we can we can probably make robots and probably make certain types of creatures that appear to be, but the lines get really complicated, and I think so much of the divisiveness in our society right now is from people pretending to think their opinion is the only one and it's all black and white. And I think there's a lot of complexity, and so I think I'm going to sit back, and I'm glad I'm 63 years old. I think I'm going to watch from another plane when some of this stuff plays out, because I just know that it's complex enough right now trying to figure out how to use cell phones in healthy ways and how to help our kids deal with social media. And when we start to move towards implantment of chips in the brain and having the access to all the collected information out there, it certainly changes how college professors teach. Yeah. And I can't imagine sentient life forms and what that's going to do. The other side of it is, I always like to raise the question to my students in a spiritual formation classes, how it would affect their spirituality if tomorrow a spaceship showed up from another solar system with life that looked like ours, but also looked very different from ours. We're going to have to really reflect, and I don't think usually black and white answers are the most useful.
It's moving awful quickly, and a lot of in my research of artificial intelligence and technology in that realm, it's not a matter of will we, it's when will we, it's number one, which isn't even really the most important question, whether it's 5 years or 50. It's how will we, in terms of the process of doing that, and who gets to make the decisions. Are we thinking about a technology really from a societal good standpoint? And there's a lot of good things. I was just reading an article about how there's this question of, can AI do a better job at screening for heart disease or cancer or something better than doctors, right? There's this whole mechanical versus human idea, and the article was saying, well, together they catch more. Well, okay, so what you're saying is the human with the right tool, catch, which would make sense. But the question, and so that sounds like a good, right, for the good of society. The question then becomes, who gets to access that good? Is it for everybody, or is it for the people that can afford it?
Right.
And one of the fears, and I know that I'm sort of getting off topic here, but one of the fears is that all this technology does, because it's being created so quickly and being accessed by powers that are already endowed economically and societal, it's just enabling them more to be able to make more profits or to have more control over, organizations or whatever the case may be. And so the question is, who gets to make those decisions? Who gets to make, should it be, is it just one, a designer for a company whose goal is to increase profits? Or should it be a much broader? Because the technology that's created is going to change. It's changing things now, as you just mentioned. But we would have never. Okay, Dick Tracy. I don't know if that's an Apple Watch you got, but right. Dick Tracy all of a sudden has come to life, and there's much more and much more powerful things that we don't even see.
Well, and the movie Jurassic World or Jurassic Dominion is out, right? So that's a great example of you can maybe do some things, but then who's thinking about whether we should do them and how they might be used in ways that are for good or for ill. And I think that's what's frightening, is that just because you can do something doesn't mean there's a moral compass on it. And
just because you can doesn't mean you should.
should, yeah.
Which is, you know, a great thing to think about a lot of things in our lives. You know, it's well, I want to thank you so very much. It was a pleasure and very informative. And I would love to have you back at some point and talk about that book. I like hearing about the spiritual and God-filled journeys.
I'd love to come back. I hope it's out this fall, and that might let me know. I'll be glad to come talk a little bit more.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas.
All right, guys. I know there's an X, but I don't know what it is anymore. It's been so long since I got us out of one of these things. We'll just leave it like that. How's that sound? Scott, thank you so much.
Oh,
I mean, truly.
great.